Good morning, everybody. Y'all find your traditional place to park. We'll get started this morning. We're about to come to the end of our video series on Does God Exist that, of course, Stephen Meyer has presented. Today, he kind of wraps some things up for us. He does a review of some of the previous lessons that we have had, and he does discuss today a little bit about some of the reasons behind why God has been left out of our modern day science and what has brought all that about, because some of the early scientists actually went out to try to figure out God's creation, and they looked at it that way. And then Darwin came along and a few others, and they tried to leave God out of the equation and use just purely naturalistic approaches to how to explain our existence here. And the deeper we get and the more we learn, the more they're finding out that they can't explain certain things with that, and that the idea of God existing is starting to come back into modern stream science again, for those who are willing to look at it. So he talks about that some today. And he uses some simple reasoning that we all have to use sooner or later to establish what the most logical explanation is for our existence here. What does the evidence say, and what conclusion does it bring you to? And I realize, and I'll be open with you, I realize there's not a lot of scripture in some of these video lessons that we've had. But I've got to tell you, if you don't have a foundation and a belief in God, then Scripture doesn't mean a whole lot. You have to have a foundation to build your faith upon for Scripture to have true meaning. And that's part of what this is about, is helping you to build a foundation, helping you to have a good argument with your neighbor when your neighbor comes to you and says there is no God. I don't believe in that. So anyways, and I got to tell you too, and you guys know this as well as I do, Satan will attack our beliefs in any kind of evidence that gives hard proof that God exists. He's going to throw some doubt in there because he doesn't want us believing in God. He wants us for himself. And of course, we want to believe in God. So anytime we got hard evidence there, Satan's going to try to throw some doubt in it. Core to our faith is the simple question, does God exist, yes or no? If the answer is yes in your mind, then all the other stuff that comes from Scripture and everything else becomes plausible and believable, and we can apply it. If the answer is no, why ever pick up a Bible in the first place? Because you're not going to believe what's in there. So the ultimate question is, does God exist, yes or no? And we've all had to come to that conclusion on our own. And I know you're all here because you do believe, or you wouldn't be here. A Sunday morning service would be a waste of time to you if you didn't believe in God. Anyways, I could go into that some more. But I got to tell you too, there's a lot of deep information in these lessons. Stuff that might just go right over your head. But what I keep wanting you all to look at is how complicated creation is and how well it works for as complicated as it is. You don't have to understand all that stuff. You just got to understand that it's complicated, and the odds of it just happening is far greater than the odds of God creating it in the first place. So we'll get into this, and he kind of summarizes what he's presented to us before, has a few other things to talk about, and we'll have some post-video conversation as well. Go ahead, Debbie, start us up.
Hey, we were having a pretty interesting discussion yesterday, and with some of you it continued the whole question about when you go into college and you find that there's all these smart people around who have different points of view, it can be kind of intimidating. And it was recalling for me some experiences I had my first year in graduate school in Cambridge. I was an American. I went to a little tiny college, and I'm suddenly in this very intimidating place with all this impressive architecture and all this history. And in Britain, they don't tell you anything about the rules. So the first day I walked across the quad, and then one of the guys in the bowler hats, the porters, he said, "Don't walk on the grass." And I didn't know you weren't supposed to walk on the grass. And how are you supposed to know these things? And he says, "It's not the done thing." And we were constantly finding out that what we had done was not the done thing. And so anyway, one day I was in a lecture. It was like the second week I was after classes had started, and there was this very famous scholar presenting a lecture on some fine point of Immanuel Kant's philosophy. And fortunately, I had had a course on Kant as an undergraduate because I took a philosophy minor. But this was like flying way over my head. And there was new stuff in this I'd never heard of. So about halfway through the lecture, I raised my hand and I said, "You know, I've never read that in Kant. Could you tell me where I could learn more about that?" And there was this kind of pall that went over the room, like some unspoken rule had just been violated. Well, then after the lecture was over, my supervisor, who was a very kindly Don of the old school, he was older, just a lovely man, and he took me aside and he said in his high Oxbridge accent, he said, "Now, Maya," he said, "I know that in the States you've learned that the only stupid question is the one you didn't ask." He said, "But," he said, "it's different here." And then he said, "Everyone here is bluffing, and if you're to succeed, you must learn to bluff too. So in future, if you have a question that reveals ignorance, please come and ask me privately," he said. And so I never did that again. But the intimidation that you can feel in the setting of higher education is very intense, especially when there are a lot of people bluffing. But I think it's made even more acute if you have a different worldview and you're aware that not everybody else is thinking the same way you are. This came home to me also my first year. After we'd have lectures, we'd retire to the pub, and everyone drank these stout brown beers and things. So I ordered the apple juice. Little did I know the apple juice also had a kick to it. But anyway, one discussion was particularly struck home to me, this factor of intimidation. There was another student in my class who was from America, who was trying very hard to fit in with the British. And he was bragging about how he'd come to an atheistic position while he was at Yale. And one of the Cambridge professors who was at this round table in the pub after lectures, he said, "Well," he said, "of course you're an atheist, but what else are you that makes you interesting?" And I think this was a revelation to me in a way, because people were so open about the fact that the worldview that I held was just not even on the table. You know, I'm a theist. I believe in God. I happen to even be Christian. And so, you know, when the professor says, "Well, of course you're an atheist," that made me pretty acutely aware that I had a different view than everyone else. If you have a different worldview, you can come in for some pretty severe ridicule. It was kind of discouraging to think that I was in such a small minority. And one thing that encouraged me a great deal was thinking about the scientists who had gone before. I was at the end of the 20th century studying the history and philosophy of science. But what I was studying was a subject that had been shaped by people who believed in God. And this came home to me absolutely every day as I was walking down the little, it was called Free School Lane, the little alley that went to my department, because my department was right next door to the famous Cavendish Laboratory. And this was a laboratory that was started at the end of the 19th century by James Clerk Maxwell. If you know anything about the history of physics, there's three great names that always pop up. There's Newton, Einstein, and James Clerk Maxwell. He was one of the three greatest physicists of all time. And when the Cavendish Laboratory was built, he insisted on having an inscription in Latin from the Psalms. And this inscription used to give me great encouragement. Let me recite it to you. See if I can get it just right. I'll peek. Okay, yeah, here's a peek. Magna opera Domini exquista in omnes voluntates ejus. Isn't that cool? Doesn't that sound cool? It's Latin, so of course it sounds cool. What's it mean? It means, great are the works of the Lord, sought out by all who take pleasure therein. Maxwell was one of those scientists we were talking about before who found his inspiration for studying nature in his belief that nature was the product of a divine intelligence. Now, this verse that's on the Great Cavendish door comes from Psalm 111. And if you go 2 verses down, there's an incredible verse that I think really captures a lot of what we've been doing here. The verse is, "He has caused his wonders to be remembered." What we're going to do today is we're going to survey some of those wonders that I think are being uniquely remembered in our time. Science is a fantastic tool for studying the works of the Lord, as Maxwell would put it. And in modern science, we have uncovered some extraordinary wonders that I think are best explained, or rather point to the Creator who made it all. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at these wonders that have been remembered by modern science in order to support the thesis that we've been building to in these preceding lectures. And the thesis is simply this, that theism, with its affirmation of a transcendent, theism, remember, is one of the big worldviews, and theism, with its affirmation of a transcendent, powerful, and intelligent creator, provides the best explanation of the key evidences concerning the origin of the universe and life. That's our thesis. That's what we're going to now try to establish based on all the things that we've looked at up to this point. So one of the things we want to do now is review, or rather survey, these amazing evidences, these wonders that we are now able to remember because of our discoveries in science, okay? Remember, we started with a discussion of the origin of the universe. And remember, we looked at the discovery that Edwin Hubble had made, that the universe is expanding outward in every direction. And we thought about what that means, just as the scientists had done, the cosmologists, and we realized that that implied a definite beginning to the universe. And recall also, that conclusion was reinforced by the physics of Einstein, his great theory of general relativity, and then also by Stephen Hawking's solutions to his famous field equations that implied not only that there was a beginning to time, but also there was a point when the universe got an infinite curvature. If you go back far enough in time, it curved infinitely tightly so that it also had a 0 point in space in finite time in the past. And then we also talked a little bit about the fine-tuning of the universe, the idea that from the very beginning of the universe, the laws of physics and chemistry were very finely tuned in their numerical constants and the strength of those laws, the expansion rate of the universe, the speed of light, and all those parameters that were just exquisitely finely tuned to allow for the possibility of life. And we also saw that many scientists just reacted very honestly to that information, saying that the most common sense interpretation of that evidence was that it pointed to an intelligence, a superintelligence, as Fred Hoyle said, who monkeyed with physics and chemistry. So in our initial lectures, we looked at the evidence from cosmology and from physics and saw that there was evidence for an intelligent and also transcendent cause. We also then looked at some evidence from biology. And when we talk about wonders being remembered, to me, this was just the historical irony of this was really acute. The Cavendish Laboratory, where this inscription is about the works of the Lord being sought out by all who take pleasure therein, is the exact place where Watson and Crick were working when they were able to uncover and discover the structure of the DNA molecule. If you just stop and think about this for a minute, when we were talking in our previous lessons about the digital code that's stored in DNA, and I must have said that 5 or 6 times. But let's just stop and take stock of what we're talking about. We're talking about machine code, software in the cell. You know, at some level, it shouldn't be that hard to figure out what this implies. This is an incredible piece of evidence. And nobody knew about this for thousands and thousands of years until 1953, 1957, the 1960s, and we've only really begun to fully appreciate all the informational properties that we have inside life. Remember my story from yesterday about my friend, the software engineer, who said, you know, I get the eerie feeling somebody has figured this out before us. We've got error correction. You know, there's actually a spell check inside the cell to make sure that when the DNA copies itself, it's copying correctly. Remember, we also saw that wonderful animation clip showing all the machinery that's involved in taking that information and using it to build machinery. So a fabulous system. What an extraordinary wonder inside life. Something that we didn't know. And I think this is where, to me, that verse about that he has caused his wonders to be remembered. I think we live in the generation when many of those wonders that were long hidden are being revealed because we have the tools through modern science to open up the cell, to see what's inside the microcosm, the smallest unit of life. And we have the tools to look deep into space and see what those little pinpricks of light are not just little dots. They're galaxies of planets, and there's structure, and there's light coming from that tells us something about the origin of the universe itself. So we live in a fantastic age. And what I want to ask today is, what does all this mean? Remember, we started our series by saying we're going to address life's big questions. And one of the biggest questions, from a philosophical or a worldview point of view, is what is the thing from which everything else comes? And I suggested at the beginning that we'd be arguing that God is the thing from which everything else comes, and that there are reasons to believe that. There are good reasons to believe that. In fact, as we're going to show, I think that God provides the best explanation of all these amazing wonders and discoveries that have come to us in the last 100 years in science. So we are using this approach of reasoning called the method of multiple competing hypotheses. And we're going to look at, we have been looking at, how the big world views, the main philosophical systems that have been devised, how they explain this evidence and which one explains them better. And so we have the evidence from cosmology, from physics, from biology, and all this evidence concerning the big origins questions, which are critical if we're trying to decide that question about the prime reality. What is the thing from which everything else comes? So we're looking at the evidence that's relevant to that question. So which worldview best explains that evidence? Well, let's reason a little bit about this. Remember, we looked at 4 big worldviews. And the reason I confined it to 4, it actually makes some sense. Ask yourself 2 questions. Does God exist? Well, how could you answer that?
Yes.
Yes or no? Okay. So if you answer it no, you have an atheistic worldview. And materialism is the atheistic worldview. Now, there are variations on that. There's a Marxist version of materialism, and there's a Western version of materialism, scientific materialism. But basically, if you say no, then you're going to say that something else besides a mind, a God, is the prime reality. You're typically going to affirm that it's matter, okay? But if you say yes to that question, then there's another question you can ask. And that question is that God personal or impersonal, okay? And the answer to that question is, well, if you say yes, then you're a classical theist, a Judeo-Christian or religious theist of some kind who believes that God is a mind to whom you can pray, who is a personal reality. And deism, we talked about, is just a variation on that view, which says that the personal God created the universe at the beginning, but then has chosen to have nothing more to do with it since then. So it's a personal but detached God. So we talked about that, but that's also a variation on theism. The other answer you could give to that question is no. God is not personal. And that is the view of pantheism, the idea that God is an impersonal oneness that is in everything and everything is in him. And most of the Eastern religions are an expression of this pantheistic worldview, with the exception perhaps of Buddhism, which is basically an atheistic religion, which is an oddity, but that's what it is, okay? So that's the reason we chose to look at just these 4. There are variations on these, but most of the considerations that we're using to decide which of these 4 is the best explanation would apply, for example, to other versions of materialism. If materialism is inadequate to explain, for example, the finite beginning of the universe, then the Marxist version of materialism would be just as inadequate as the Western scientific version, okay? Same with nihilism or atheistic existentialism, which are also worldviews that have distinctives, but they flow from that basic current of materialistic thought. So we're not trying to overly simplify things, but we're trying to get some traction in analysis so that we can make some sense of all this. So let's reason about this. We talked about the Big Bang singularity and the anthropic fine-tuning. And remember our rule of reasoning. That is the rule that, in fact, Darwin used in his own investigations of the past. If we're looking for a best explanation, we want an explanation which, if true, would provide a cause that's sufficient to produce the effect in question. And we said that when we're looking at that finite beginning to the universe and the fine-tuning, that the cause which, if true, would best explain that evidence is a cause which transcends matter, space, time, and energy, and which is intelligent and rational, or a conscious intelligence. That's what we know from experience, that conscious intelligence produces that kind of fine-tuning evidence we saw. So when we analyze it that way, both pantheism and naturalism, which deny a conscious, intelligent agency as the prime reality, and which, especially in the case of naturalism or materialism, another word for it, affirms that the universe is eternal and self-existent, these two worldviews fail to provide a causally adequate account for that key evidence of the fine-tuning and the beginning of the universe. We also brought in the biological evidence, and we saw that there was this critical feature that needs to be explained. What runs the show in biology is information. And so if you want to explain the origin of life, you have to first explain the origin of the information that would be needed to produce the first life. Let me ask you guys a question. If you want your computer to perform a new function, what do you have to give it?
Code.
Program.
You all know this better than people who are older than I am, right? You've lived in this high-tech information technology world. Code is critical to function in your computer. The same thing is true in life. You want to build a new protein, you want to build life in the first place, you want to get a new form of life from a pre-existing form of life, you've got to have information. And so the critical question for the origin of life is the question of the origin of information. We saw that there's a strong reason for favoring the idea of an intelligent cause over undirected mechanisms as the explanation for the origin of information. And that is that using the rule of reasoning that Charles Lyell and Charles Darwin themselves used, that we should be looking for causes now in operation. In other words, causes that we know can produce the effect in question. And what cause did we say is known to produce information?
Intelligence.
Intelligence, mind. That's what we know from our uniform and repeated experience, which is, again, part of the scientific method of reasoning. And so we came to the conclusion, based on that understanding that information is habitually the product of conscious activity, that when we're looking at code and information in the cell, we're looking at the distinctive byproduct, a hallmark of intelligent activity. And so we could infer back to an intelligent cause. Well, if there is now intelligence at work in the history of life, then we now have a way of adjudicating the question of whether deism or theism provides a better explanation for the totality of the evidence that we've looked at from cosmology, physics, and biology. Because the biological evidence is saying that there is evidence of an infusion of information into the biosphere. In fact, what created the biosphere was information, and that takes place sometime after the beginning of the universe. Now, according to the deistic worldview, the deistic creator chooses to confine his creative activity to the very beginning of the universe. He winds the universe up like a great clock and then lets it go and has nothing more to do with it. But we have evidence here for a discrete action of an intelligent agent in bringing life into being. Theism can explain that. Deism cannot. It's in the nature of the deistic hypothesis. So as we look now at the totality of the evidence, we see that of the four great worldviews, theism provides the best explanation of the Big Bang, the finite universe, the fine-tuning, and the evidence of design in biology. So I think what we have here is an exciting development in our Western intellectual history. 300 years ago, the Enlightenment philosophers said that the God arguments of the medievals didn't work. Darwin came along and added fuel to that fire and said, there's no evidence for design in biology, and therefore, as Richard Dawkins has explained, we might as well think of God as a delusion. But now what we see is evidence of design in physics from the very beginning of the universe. We see evidence of design in biology coming down the timeline. And we have evidence for a finite beginning of the universe as a whole, suggesting a cause that transcends matter, space, time, and energy. And when you put all that together, there's only one worldview that can make sense of that. And that worldview is the theistic worldview that affirms the existence of a God who is outside of time, who is powerful, and who is intelligent and rational. So we see from the scientific evidence all those attributes that biblical theists have always believed were part of the nature of God. Now there's one other category of evidence that adds to this overall picture. We haven't really talked much about the whole question of biological evolution, of how you get from the first life to all the new forms of life. But the idea within the framework of Darwinism, or in modern times what's called modern neo-Darwinism, has been, again, that there's evidence of apparent design but not real design. there's no real evidence of design after the beginning of life because the Darwinian mechanism can explain all that evidence. But there's a fantastic pattern in the fossil record, a fantastically intriguing pattern that I think creates a challenge to that Darwinian perspective. And it's perhaps best exemplified with an event called the Cambrian explosion. Now, according to the standard geological timescale, that took place about 530 million years ago. But it took place within a very narrow window of time, geologically speaking, between 2 and 10 million years, depending on who you talk to. And in the same seam in the rock all the way around the world, whether you're looking in the Cambrian strata in China, or in the Burgess Shale in Canada, or in England, you have evidence of the sudden appearance of all the major new, what are called body plans, the new ways of arranging organs and tissues to form fundamentally new types of animals. Now, according to the Darwinian picture of the history of life, you should have this great big branching tree where one thing morphs gradually into another through small incremental variations that are produced by natural selection acting on random variations and mutations. But instead of that gradual morphing, what we see in the fossil record is a very sudden appearance of all the major forms of life, the major body plans, represented by the gold dots. The blue dots are all the missing evidence, all the things that ought to be there on Darwin's theory that aren't there, the ancestral precursors that just aren't there. So what we have is something that's very difficult. It was difficult for Darwin to explain at the time. It's very difficult to explain now, not only because the fossil record and the picture in the history of life that the fossils provide isn't consistent with Darwin's picture of the history of life, but also because of the other mystery we've already talked about. If you want to give your computer a new function, what do you have to give it? Code. You want to produce a new form of life from a pre-existing form of life, what do you have to provide for it? Code. Okay? 2 million years, 10 million years sounds like a great deal of time. But when you run the math and do the math on how difficult it is to build by chance mutations, even a single protein. Remember we ran some of those numbers in a couple lessons ago. It turns out this is just as big a problem for Darwinian evolution as it is for chemical evolution. There's not enough time, the mutation rates aren't fast enough, there's simply not enough time to search all those possible ways of arranging things to generate new proteins. So the information problem that we looked at with respect to the origin of the first life is also a problem in Darwinian or neo-Darwinian evolution. And that's a reason why I think there's evidence of design at discrete intervals further along the biological timeline. And we have this, I think, most dramatically, or very dramatically with the Cambrian, but I used to tell my students, you will know them by their euphemisms. In paleontology, there are lots of examples of geologically sudden appearances of major new groups of organisms. There's the mammalian radiation. That's the euphemism, sudden appearance. About 13 to 15 orders of new mammals come suddenly into the fossil record in the Eocene period. But before that, the big bloom, not the Big Bang, the big bloom of flowering plants in the Cretaceous. That's also a sudden appearance event. There's something called the marine Mesozoic revolution, okay? Another sudden appearance of the sea reptiles, and then the Cambrian explosion as well. So there's lots of examples of the sudden appearance of innovation in form and function in the history of life. And I think that the overall pattern is one that cannot be explained simply by the undirected mechanism of natural selection acting on random variation. So while you don't need this argument to support the case that I've been making for the existence of God, it adds additional support to see that there's other evidence of a designing intelligence acting throughout the history of life. Okay? One other little piece that adds to that picture just a bit more is this exquisite, I think these are real wonders, these miniature machines that are being discovered inside cells. This is an animation of a machine called a bacterial flagellar motor. My colleague Michael Behe has made this famous in his book, Darwin's Black Box. But this motor has O-rings and bushings and a drive shaft and a U-joint and a rotor and a stator, and it's an exquisite piece of engineering. It's a true rotary engine. It rotates in some organisms at 100,000 RPM and can turn directions on a quarter of a turn. It's hardwired into something called a signal transduction circuit, which gives the organism information from the environment that helps it direct itself towards the food it needs. And this little motor resides in a little tiny bacterium, the E. coli. You've probably heard of it from some of the hamburger scandal fame. Okay, people get sick. But anyway, what I like to say is it's high tech in low life. Okay, exquisite machinery in a little tiny bacterium. Now, in addition to that, there are other machines that have been discovered inside cells. Parker drew this today for us. It's a fantastic rendition of a little tiny machine called an ATP synthase. And what it is, it's a little turbine that it runs on the same principle as a hydroelectric dam. It has a rotor down here, a flow of acid drives the rotor, creates torque on this stalk, creates a conformational change in the proteins up here that create a little pocket that enable it to catalyze a reaction and form the little battery packs, the ATP molecules that have all the energy that our cells need to survive. Exquisite technology. They're working right now in the mitochondria of your cells. You've got all this exquisite machinery going right now, hundreds and thousands of times a second. It's just fabulous what's going on. So these are the kinds of things that are being revealed. I won't go through all of Michael Behe's argument for design based upon, he calls these systems irreducibly complex. I'd like to call them functionally integrated high-tech systems. But whatever you call them, they provide, I think, compelling evidence for intelligent design. And if you want to get into this more, get into Behe's work and follow the debate and the argument about it. Okay? But in any case, we've got more evidence of design along that cosmic timeline. So when you survey all of this, again, I think the case for theism is building from scientific evidence alone. We're going to look at some other considerations that support the existence of God in the next two lessons that we're going to look at. But just from science alone, quite contrary to the message of the new atheists, the Dawkinses and the Hitchens, I sometimes wonder what planet they're living on. Are they even aware of this stuff going on? They're not talking about it in their books. They're critiquing the arguments of medieval philosophers many times. And so, quite contrary to the message that science has made belief in God delusional, I think science is providing a form of support that is, in any other realm of inquiry, would be considered overwhelming, beyond reasonable doubt. Not a proof in the deductive sense of absolute certainty, but certainly beyond reasonable doubt. Now, one of the things that kind of underscores this, and is an extraordinary event really in the history of philosophy, the most prominent atheist among all the philosophers of the 20th century is a man named Antony Flew. As a young man, he debated C.S. Lewis at Oxford on the God question. Late in life, in 2004, he announced that he had come to accept the existence of some kind of God or creator based, he said, largely on developments in modern science. Interestingly, he referenced the work of these crazy American design theorists and said that his view was becoming increasingly like theirs, and he specifically mentioned the problem of explaining the origin of the information in DNA by reference to any materialistic explanation. So, and it underscores something an historian of science has said, Frederick Burnham. He says, the idea that God created the universe is a more respectable hypothesis today than at any time in the last 100 years. Do you remember in one of our very early lessons, I cited the story of Laplace before Napoleon and how he was asked, why don't you mention God in your work like Sir Isaac Newton did? And he said, sire, I have no need of that hypothesis. I won't try to run that French accent at you one more time. Okay. Sire, I have no need of that hypothesis. Well, we live in a new day. And 200 years after Laplace and 150 years after Darwin, we have an ensemble of evidences that I think have brought back that hypothesis. So I like to call this lecture the return of the God hypothesis, because I think it's back, it's stronger than ever, and it's very solidly supported by all these wonderful wonders that have been remembered to us by the discoveries of modern science.
Here's the big question. Based on what you've heard, do you find enough evidence for a rational, powerful God that transcends and lives above all of creation? Based on what you've considered, what do you think is the best explanation for what you plainly see? If you go hiking up into the mountains at night, when it's dark and where the air is crisp and clean, and set up a camera on time-lapse, you can see the stars and the galaxies in an entirely new way. My hope is that you're beginning to see the beauty and the wonder of it all.
Okay. I don't know about you, but there was some stuff in there. This philosophy thing kind of blows right over Randy's head, but I get the general idea of all of it. But one of the things I find remarkable is sometimes the harder we try to prove that God doesn't exist, the more evidence shows up that proves that he does. And I think back to Bible stories that we read about, and I think about, and I mentioned this last Sunday night in our Sunday evening worship time, that when Jesus told the apostles to go feed those 5,000 people with a couple baskets full of a few fish and some loaves of bread, and when they were done, they had more than they started with. God has a way of making things known to where there are no discussions about where it came from, where the evidence shows to those who are looking that there is no other choice. There is no other source than God. And I think the more we learn and the deeper we dig into our own existence, the more God's going to be proved out in the long run, regardless of what we do or do not understand now. He cited a couple scriptures out of the book of Psalms, and I think about what David knew about creation at the time those were penned. He didn't know a whole lot. He had a good idea, but he didn't know the science behind any of it. Well, we got the science behind at least some of it. And I don't know how much longer God's got planned for us to be here on this earth, but if we go another couple thousand years or whatever that time might be, what we know today will seem as insignificant as what David knew at the time he penned those words. That's how much more I think we have yet to discover. Very remarkably constructed. He kind of mentioned today, and I think there's some truth behind it, how hard it is to promote God as a creator to someone who has no belief in God. I think all of us face that on a day-to-day basis. How do you convince somebody to believe in God and then to obey the commands that God has given us, to turn their life towards God instead of away from God? That can be a hard subject to deal with sometimes, but when you can throw hard evidence in front of them that says there is a God, that story becomes much easier to tell. That's part of what this series was about. I appreciated his comments on encouraging us to build our own basis for faith and look at the evidence yourself and draw your own conclusions. Don't depend on what he told you. Don't depend on what I tell you, because in the end, your faith is yours. I cannot build your faith. You have to build your faith. If you don't have deep-seated convictions in your own heart that God exists and that he's capable of these things, you have a very shallow foundation to build your faith upon. And every time something challenges you, your faith is going to be challenged, and the chances of you failing that test will be stronger than if you have a deep-seated faith in God. I appreciated that because I cannot make your faith and you cannot make mine. I'm responsible for my own. I really appreciated his comments there. I kind of want to reemphasize, I think the strongest point to me, and Craig's kind of mentioned this to me as well, when we start discussing the complexity of things, I like to reemphasize the idea of the magnitude and the idea of the information. I don't know if you understand what he's talking about when he says information. When he mentioned information here, it's the organization of data, an organization of things that give the code that tells how all of the chemicals and everything else to work within us, that DNA, so to speak. I am somewhat familiar with machine code. I work with that every day. And we write down electronic code and tell an electronic machine, this is where you move and this is the cut you make and the things you need to do to produce an airplane part. And even the simplest of those programs, that code, is 200 to 300 lines long. And one thing out of place, you can crash the whole machine. That's how intricate this stuff really is. In the most complex parts, there are thousands of lines of code that are involved. We occasionally have employees who will, what we call fat finger a digit in a number somewhere. Instead of typing in 1.5 inches to movement in the x-axis or whatever, and I'm getting into stuff you probably don't understand, they type in 0.15 or the opposite of that. They get the decimal place in the wrong place. Instead of the machine moving 150 thousandths, it moves 1.5 inches and runs right into the side of the machine because that's what the code told it to do. And of course, whatever breaks first is what breaks. It doesn't take anything, something as simple as a single decimal place being out of place, to cause the whole machine to crash. And we talk about this information. And he used the alphabet in this series about trying to explain that. You can, if you look at amino acids as letters in the alphabet, you can arrange them in all kinds of random orders and not spell a single word if you use the letter analogy. But when you organize letters by design, you make words out of those in a language we all understand. You start building that code. And when you look even in an individual cell, that information that's in there takes those amino acids and builds proteins, words, so to speak, and then arranges those proteins into sentences that mean something, and then arranges those sentences into chapters in a book that means something holistically. And you build a novel. There is novels of information within a single cell, all designed to perform a specific function. That's the kind of magnitude of stuff we're talking about here. And the ultimate question is, can this happen on its own without any divine intervention, without any intelligent design? Or is there really God behind all of it? And I don't know about you, but my conclusion is God every time. The deeper I look at this, the more I reason out the idea that it just happens. I cannot see the logic behind assuming it just happens. And once I build that, then all the stuff I don't understand, this deep-seated belief that God exists, all the stuff I don't understand, then gets set off to the side because my belief in God is the foundation for who I am. Someday we'll probably learn the stuff we don't know about. One of the biggest rubs against all of this Big Bang Theory and everything else is the timeline it took to make it all happen. Biblically, we're looking at 6,000 years, I think, if I remember right, from the time the world was created till now. But if you look at the fossil records and everything else, the evidence we have in front of us, that timeline is much greater. I've reasoned in my own mind that if God can create all of that stuff, He can lay it all out just like it is right now, just as fast as He wants. But I don't understand all that yet, but we will someday. But I hope this series has helped you with that. I'm debating about what we're going to see next week. We may go back into our standard weekly studies, but Dr. Myers does go into the idea of morality. He spends 2 lessons on morality and how morality, our natural sense of morality, didn't come from us. It came from somewhere else. And I'm going to go look through both of those. We may watch those the next 2 weeks. I don't know for sure. I got to talk to Perry about that. But anyways, any questions, comments, or what time we got? Oh yeah, we're running a little bit late. Any comments at all? I appreciate your patience here. But again, my thought behind this entire series was to help you lay a foundation of faith, give you some evidence to discuss with your neighbors when it comes to how do you explain all of this stuff. Because if you don't have a foundation with your own heart that believes that God exists, then the scriptures that we study each and every day really don't have a lot of meaning to you because there's no foundation underneath them. Please, let's share a prayer together and we'll be dismissed. Our Heavenly Father, Lord, thank you for helping us to discover what you've created. And Lord, I, for one, am marveled at what I see there. And when I think about all that stuff, everything I see that you've created around us, Lord, I don't see how any of that could have just happened. Lord, I know you're behind it all. So, Lord, thank you for our time together, Lord, and once again helping us to understand, to show us some of the wonders that exist within our universe, within the things we see around us, and Lord, how remarkable each one of us is in its own right, right down to the individual cell. Lord, thank you for your love and care. Lord, in such a large universe, at times we can seem like such a small thing, but Lord, you've made us a priority in the things you do. And Lord, it's our hope and intent to make you a priority in the things that we do. Lord, it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.